So my job today is to set the global context before we go on to look at UK brands, specifically with Adele, shortly. And to do that, to look at global brands and UK brands, we're going to draw on the power and the depth of BrandZ's vast database. So we're talking about millions of consumer interviews, tens of thousands of unique brands. And Kantar has been building this BrandZ database for a quarter of a century, would you believe? So 25 years of data and insights for us to draw from. We did our first consumer interviews way back in 1998. And one of the key things we do with that extensive database is feed our brand valuations process, which is unique to Kantar and unique to BrandZ. We launched our first ever global top 100 most valuable brands in 2006. And this is the 7th year of our top 75 most valuable UK brands. So starting with some global context, as I said. So if we zoom back to 2006 and look at the total aggregate value of our first ever global top 100 most valuable brands, that came in at a huge $1.4 trillion. If we then fast forward to last year, so 2022, by that point, the value of our global top 100 had reached a whopping $8.7 trillion. So an unprecedented period of growth, as you can see, and a growth of more than 500% from 2006. However, sadly, as we all know, all good things must come to an end. So when we look at this year's results and our 2023 figure for the total value of our global top 100, it had actually slipped for the first time ever and by quite a massive amount. So down to $6.9 trillion overall. And to put that in context, that's a fall of 20%. So a fifth of that total value was wiped off our global top 100 in just a 12-month period. Nearly $2 trillion of brand value lost almost overnight, which begs a pretty obvious question. Why? What's going on? And I'm sure many of us know at least part of the answer to that question. It's been a very tumultuous 18-month period. There's been a lot going on for the global economy. Most of it, all of it, not good. We've had world events like the war in Ukraine, weakening growth forecasts. We've had markets dealing with reduced demand. We've had lots of pressure on all of us as consumers, rising living costs, and need to economise. And for brands and businesses, they've been dealing with price rises. They've been dealing with reduced profitability, issues with supply chain, you name it. So if we add all of those factors together, it's hardly a surprise that we've seen such a big impact on brand values this year. So does that mean that brands are no longer worth trying to build? Is marketing not adding value to business? Well, if you know Kantar, I'm sure you know the answer to that question. We believe is a firm no. And to tell you why and show you why, I'm going to use one of BrandZ's, probably the most famous BrandZ slide there is. You may have seen this before. If you've not, let me explain. So as I said earlier, we launched our first ever global top 100 back in 2006. And from that point, we tracked 4 portfolios of brand performance and their returns for shareholders. The MSCI World Index at the bottom there, the S&P 500, BrandZ's Strong Brands portfolio in yellow, and within that, the top 10 brands in terms of their brand equity. So those brands with the strongest overall consumer relationships. So a wobbly trend chart. Any good quant researcher worth their salt will tell you, trying to interpret a wobbly trend chart, you need to do one thing, which is look for the underlying trend to remove some of that noise. And I can do that with one simple arrow. So if we look at that yellow line, BrandZ's Strong Brands portfolio from the global financial crisis, 2007, 2008, and we can see there's been a very clear growth trajectory. And the interesting point there is the one right at the end, because this year's 2023 results, although we've seen that large decline, they're actually a continuation of a much longer term trend. The exceptional years were actually the COVID-19 year in 2020, where we saw the huge drop, the over-optimistic market recovery following that, and then the market shock macroeconomic impacts that we've seen. So actually, what we're saying with this data is brands absolutely are still adding value to their businesses. Marketing is absolutely still a worthwhile investment. And even more than that, in the last quarter, we're now seeing those brands with the strongest consumer relationships, the strongest brand equity, begin to kick on again and outperform even further S&P and MSCI. Speaking of brand equity, and we talk about it a lot at Kantar, Amy mentioned earlier meaningful difference, and we measure and quantify that intangible asset of brand with what we call the Meaningful, Different and Salient Framework, or MDS framework for short. We firmly believe that brands need to deliver on 3 key areas versus their competitors if they're going to set themselves up for strong relationships and to be a success. One of those is meaningful. That is basically delivering on consumer rational needs, and also making a superior emotional connection to direct competitors. Difference is literally standing apart from the rest in a positive way, but also being seen as a leader and an innovator in your respective category and competitive set is helpful. And finally, the third key component is salience, which is all about coming to mind quickly, readily, easily in response to a certain consumer need. So meaningful, different, salient, MDS, 3 key things to remember. The other point to make here is that throughout Kantar's Insight Solutions, this framework runs not just through brand, not just through BrandZ, but through creative, innovation, CX, media, and more to tie together our full offer, enabling you to work with us in a much more strategic way. Now, using that language and going back to some basic analysis of our global top 100, we were interested to see what has been the impact on consumer relationships and brand equity post-COVID. So here we've got our 3 key elements: meaningful, different, salient. We're looking at index data. So anything above 100 is a good performance. So if we look at the grey bars to start with, our pre-COVID data in 2019, what do we see? We see brands with typically very strong relationships. Not surprising for our global top 100, but very strong performance on both meaningful and different and salient as well. What's happened in the intervening period, though, if we look at the data from this year? And the answer is not much. Those brands have still got very strong relationships. And what this effectively means is 2 things. 1, marketers are still very much doing their jobs, which is good news for us all. But secondly, the declines that we've seen in brand value that I talked about are absolutely not typically due to weakening consumer relationships and weakening brand equity. They are due to that difficult, volatile macroeconomic picture that I described earlier. And to make that point even more clearly, I wanted to share 2 examples of brands that are bucking the trend and still achieving growth because of their commitment to marketing investment and their commitment to growing and improving their brand equity. The first, maybe an obvious one, Coca-Cola, a global brand we're all very familiar with within our BrandZ top 10 most valuable global brands. And in the last 12 months, Coke has actually achieved the really impressive feat of improving brand value globally by 9%, which in the context of the average food and beverage brand declining by 3% is a really impressive achievement. And if we think of some of the reasons why, at least part of the answer was in CEO James Quincy's address to shareholders and investors back in February, where he very clearly linked increasing marketing expenditure to a goal of growing the business overall. And in fact, when we look at our brand equity data this year, from the BrandZ database on Coke, we've seen already strong equity for the brand go to the next level and actually improve globally in all 3 of those areas. And at the same time, Coke has had a very good year in terms of growing volume shares globally too. Second example from a very different sphere. So Airtel, a huge Indian telco, and the fastest growing brand in brand value terms in our most valuable global brands reports this year, growing at an incredible 24%. And again, bucking the category trend. The average telco actually shrank in value by 10%. So 24% growth was an incredible achievement by Airtel. But Airtel's a really interesting example. And if we go back to 2017, they faced a huge disruption to the local market. A brand called Jio entered the market for the first time in India, offering, would you believe, completely free data to new customers, which obviously was a huge disruption. It resulted in a massive, we're talking tens of millions of signups in that first year, taking a chunk of Airtel's market share, also taking a chunk of Vodafone's market share. So what did Airtel do? They took a step back. They strove again to understand the market, understand their consumers, and understand that consumers actually want great experience. They want great customer service at the heart of what they expect from a telco. So their mission statement became a hunger to win customers for life and retain those customers clearly. And they came up with a new campaign called Open to Questions, where they really doubled down on customer service and experience. And they committed So there are literally hundreds of millions of customers within India. Any query, any problem with the Airtel service was resolved within a 24-hour period, which was quite the commitment, but the campaign has been a big success. Airtel has gone from strength to strength in terms of re-establishing equity and re-establishing market share after that major disruption. So two very different examples from completely different walks of the brand life, if you like, but hopefully compelling examples that strong brands can still achieve growth with the right strategy despite these challenging conditions. Now, I've talked a number of times, and we do at Kantar, around this notion of brand equity, which is sometimes quite difficult to relate to. So what do we really mean by brand equity? And we really mean predisposition. And this is a key task. I know marketers and marketing teams have many, many tasks to think about, but this is absolutely a key task for marketing teams to consider. Are they establishing and imbuing the brand with associations that come to mind at decision time that can help load the dice and influence decisions that consumers and businesses, because this is true of B2B as well, are making in the moment? So we believe that predisposition is at the very heart of brand equity and brand building, and it is something that is overlooked by, frankly, too many marketing teams. But in itself, this notion of predisposition is quite tricky to think about. So what I thought we would do at this point is have, dare I say it, a little bit of fun in inverted commas. So what we would like you to do is just take 30 seconds and just think about, who do you think is the greatest marketer of all time? And I'll give you a clue. So I'm going to reveal the answer in a few seconds. Think about what I just said about predisposition as being central to the role of a successful marketer. So just take a second to yourself, maybe type it into the chat, maybe shout it at the screen. Who do you think is the greatest marketer of all time? And I did ask this question to the team the other day. We asked it to a few people this morning. Some of the usual names came up: Steve Jobs, Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson for some. A few smart people said James Quincy because they'd seen my presentation about Coke, so that was appreciated as well. So hopefully you've got an answer by now. So to answer my own question, the greatest marketer of all time, in my opinion at least, is this man to the right. I'm hoping a number of you out there, hopefully the majority, have seen the film The Karate Kid before. If you have, or even if you haven't, I'm sure you're thinking at this point, what on earth is he talking about? So let me explain. A core premise of the film is Daniel, or to the left, or Daniel-san, as Mr. Miyagi likes to call him in the film, wants to learn karate to defend himself from the school bullies. So effectively, Mr. Miyagi agrees to teach him karate. He invites Daniel over to his house, and over the course of roughly a week, 5 days, with Miyagi, he is setting Daniel-san tasks to do around the house, in the garden. Very repetitive tasks, very boring tasks from Daniel's perspective. So to name three, he asks him to wax his car one day. He asks him to paint the fence another day. He asks him to sand the floor on the decking the next day. But the key thing that Miyagi asks Daniel to do with all of those tasks on separate days is repeat very repetitive actions to, for example, wax the car. He must put the wax on with a certain motion. He must take the wax off with another slightly different motion. And by the end of the week, Daniel is getting increasingly frustrated. He confronts Mr. Miyagi and says, "What on earth is going on? I'm supposed to be learning karate. You're not teaching me karate. You're effectively using me as free labor. When are we going to start these lessons?" And at that point, Mr. Miyagi reveals his genius. He pretends to attack Daniel-san, while at the same time calling out instructions to Daniel that he's asked him to do with those household chores. So he goes to punch him with his right hand, at the same time saying to Daniel, "Show me, wax off." Daniel makes the motion, he blocks the punch. He goes to punch him with his left hand and shouts, "Wax on," and Daniel makes the motion, he blocks the punch. Through various punches and kicks, calling on the tasks he's asked Daniel to do, Daniel's automatically making those moves to block. So all along, it turns out that Daniel has been predisposed. He has been learning karate. He has been learning those defensive moves. Mr. Miyagi is an absolute master of predisposition. He is eliciting certain behavior and associations from his target market, in this case Daniel, to be cued by certain external stimuli. And that is why Mr. Miyagi is a master of predisposition. That is why he is the greatest marketer of all time. And he has so much more to teach us about marketing. We'll be hearing more from Adele-san shortly when she talks about how this applies to UK brands. So look out for that in a couple of minutes' time. And if, like me, as a child, you always wondered why Mr. Miyagi was a karate teacher but walked around with pens in his top pocket, we now know he was moonlighting as a CMO all along. So If you'll forgive me that slight aside, that hopefully instructive aside though, my final task of the morning is to introduce you to this year's Kantar BrandZ Top 75 Most Valuable UK Brands. Thank you.
Thanks, Martin. And congratulations to all of our top 75 this year. What a great set of brands. We'll be seeing more from some of those that feature here, including this year's 2 new entries during the rest of the session. But first, let's start with the bigger picture trend of the results this year and what you can take away from it. Martin's already told you about the 20% drop in value for the global top 100 year on year, and it's a similar trajectory for the UK top 75, where the total value declined by 14%. And of course, some of the same factors Martin mentioned are the reason why. But uncertainty and volatility aren't the whole story. In this year's Top 75, as ever, we see the power of brands. Not only were consumer attitudes to brands more stable than the fluctuations in the financials, we yet again saw examples of strong brands that were able to navigate the tricky conditions well. One of those brands is Dove. From the campaign for Real Beauty's inception with supermodels and airbrushing almost 20 years ago, to this year's work about the impact of social media on the body image of girls and young women, Dove is a master of fresh consistency. Despite the longevity of their central positioning, the brand scores are still increasing on things like great advertising and, amazingly, a brand that will gain importance in the future. They also topped Kantar's Inclusion Index rankings this year, and all of this has helped them strengthen their predisposition. What's more, that stronger predisposition has been converting into sales at the shelf, resulting in the 6th largest penetration gains in 2022. Dove also grew in brand value this year, and we're delighted to say that it enters the top 10 of the most valuable UK brands. Ultimately, despite the market volatility, strong brands continued to offer resilience and insulation for businesses this year. Brands that improved their predisposition share were twice as resilient. Brands that delivered clear net growth in value had 25% stronger predisposition with consumers. And brands that bucked category value trends retained $20 billion in value that otherwise would have been lost. So whilst it might seem unwise to gamble when uncertainty is the order of the day, the message is clear. If you are going to bet on your brand. But there's something else the UK results have to tell us this year. We talked about the year-on-year trend in value, but let's take a more medium-term view. And when we do that, we hear the distant ringing of warning bells. When we look at the trajectory since 2020, the global top 100 brands is unlocking 6.5 times more value than the UK top 75. So what's going on? Well, it partly comes down to the building blocks that help predispose people towards brands. How predisposed someone is to a brand is a function of how meaningful, how different, and how salient it is to them. Being meaningful, meeting emotional and functional needs. Being different, standing out as unique and leading the way. And being salient, coming to mind easily when making a purchase decision. And using BrandZ evaluations alongside brand equity data, we know that those brands that deliver these three things have 5 times the commercial brand value growth of brands that don't. And this starts to help us understand what's going on. We took a look at how the UK top 75 brands compared to rankings from 7 other markets when it comes to how meaningful, how different, and how salient people think they are. And since 2020, the UK top 75 brands remain ranked 6th on meaningful. They've moved up 2 places on salient from 8th to 6th, but have dropped a place for difference from 7th to 8th of 8. The UK top 75 are doing better relatively on mental availability. This is good, this is helpful, but it's not enough. Here's a brand that's not in our UK top 75, but has been in the news recently, that illustrates what can happen at the extreme end of this trend. Wilko have a shape to their brand strength, which is familiar to many brands that have exited the UK high street over the past few years, including Thomas Cook, Debenhams and Woolworths. They have what we call a salience gap. They have good mental availability. They're well known and they come to mind for a range of category needs and occasions, but they lack the meaningful difference to match, and that imbues the brand with risk. This has seen them struggle to compete in an increasingly cluttered landscape where brands like B&M have made inroads within the same price partition, offering, as far as consumers are concerned, even better value. So the top 75 most valuable UK brands are doing relatively better on mental availability, but relatively worse on difference. And this has a significant implication because over the past few years, we've seen time and again that it is difference that makes the difference. Oxford University's Said Business School proved that how different brands are perceived to be is the number one driver of abnormal market returns. BrandZ has shown us that how different a brand is perceived to be explains 50% of its ability to charge a higher price, and that brands with strong difference have twice the price inelasticity. As we find ourselves at the end of the era of free money, it's not too much of a stretch to say that it's the marketers who master difference that will unlock the most consistent, profitable growth over the next decade. So yes, bet on your brand, but think beyond building salience and even relevance. To really unlock consistent, profitable growth, bet on your brand and dial up your difference. But how? Well, there's only one man we can turn to. Okay, prepare yourselves because we're going all in now. As Martin mentioned, Mr. Miyagi teaches Daniel-san through a series of lessons. Well, we're going to revisit some of those lessons now because they have something to offer to help you knock out your own opponents. Paint the fence. In this lesson, Daniel has to painstakingly and deliberately paint the fence with very slow, precise movements, and it takes a very long time. So long, he feels like it's a job that will never be done. And that's sort of a bit like difference. Let me explain. Lesson 1. Difference isn't an absolute. Take a look at these 6 well-known brands. Which is the most different? And remember, when we're measuring brand difference, we're measuring two dimensions. To what extent the brand seems different to others, not the same as everyone else, and to what extent the brand is leading the way, not following everyone else. Which of these brands do you think is the most different? Do you have an answer? Well, here is the answer. It doesn't matter. It doesn't help sales for Sky if Sky is more different than Airbnb. For the same logic that if I go out to buy some paint for the hallway, I won't come home with an iPhone because it's more different than Farrow and Ball. What matters is perceived relative difference. Perceived in people's minds, relative to the other alternatives available. And this is because perceived relative difference can make you that little bit less substitutable. And this is particularly important if you need your brand to command a higher than category average price. Here's one brand that has been flying in the face of that challenge. The overall M&S brand is number 36 in this year's top 75 most valuable UK brands, and they've been celebrating re-entering the FTSE 100 with a 19-month high in their share price, which is frankly amazing. Here we're going to focus for a moment on M&S Food. Consumer perceptions include M&S Food being seen as the best at what they do and really caring for their customers. And even their activities in environmental responsibility score highly, thanks to things like their farm to food hall campaign. Their dine-in, gastropub or pizza bundles hit a sweet spot of something special enough for a Friday night treat whilst comparing favourably in price to a takeaway or even eating out. And all of this helps M&S have a sector-leading score on brand difference, which gives them the highest pricing power of any brand in the grocery retail category. The bottom line is, whilst they might be a bit more expensive, they're worth it. And it's their perceived relative difference that helps. Perhaps the most famous lesson of them all: wax on, wax off. Daniel San is tasked with waxing Mr. Miyagi's car in a very specific way. He has to wax on with one hand clockwise and wax off with the other counterclockwise. And for the exercise to work, he needs both. And this brings us to lesson 2. You need to be both different and meaningful to maximise growth. Here's a brand that's a great example of this and one of our new entries for this year. Monzo was one of a bunch of disruptor brands to break habits in the finance sector. They've always been recognised as different versus the wider banking set in the UK. But what's interesting is how they are scaling their difference by becoming more meaningful and more salient, both of which have increased by 40% since 2019. In turn, we've seen their predisposition almost double during that time, and they now have 7.5 million current account customers, with a record-breaking 80% happy to recommend them. And we are super happy to welcome them to the top 75 family. But Monzo is still a smaller challenger brand. How is this different for bigger or leader brands? How do they grow through being meaningful and different? Well, we can start to answer that by looking at where incremental growth comes from for brands of different sizes. What you're about to see here is where incremental growth came from year on year from sales data across a huge number of brands and categories. So to get you oriented, first of all, there are 3 sources for incremental growth: from your existing brand buyers buying more, people switching to your brand from another brand, or people who bought the category for the first time and chose your brand. And you'll see the proportions of those sources of growth will change as the size of the brands change. So over on the left is the proportions for smaller brands, and over on the right, we'll see where incremental growth comes from for the bigger brands. Smaller brands get most of their incremental growth from people switching from other brands to them. They steal share. Bigger brands get not much at all from switching, and a decent chunk from existing buyers. Their incremental growth opportunities are to expand the category and bring new people in who haven't bought before. And we can summarise that like this. Smaller brands need to break habits, disrupt habitual behaviours, chip away and steal from the bigger brands, provide what the category needs, but in a way that gets attention. Bigger brands need to break boundaries, spot the workarounds and the pain points at the periphery of the category and in adjacent categories to find growth in new spaces. And here's a brand now ubiquitous in UK high streets who continues to do just that. Costa Coffee's acquisition by Coca-Cola has had a big influence, putting a new spin on the old Coca-Cola ambition of being within arm's reach of desire. Costa now have over 12,000 self-serve machines and are a regular feature on supermarket shelves with their chilled, ready-to-drink range. The contribution to the business performance is significant. Costa helps to make coffee Coca-Cola's leading category for sales growth. But in all of this expansion, they haven't forgotten how to do the basics well. Whilst they beat the whole sector for their scores on leading the way, no one scores higher on a brand you hear good things about or best at what they do. They stand out as different by leading the way, and they find new ways to maximise their relevance. They are both different and meaningful. Now, this one might be better known by the Karate Kid fans amongst you as the crane kick, but it's really about balance. And brands that are strong on difference, like Daniel San doing his crane kick atop a log, manage a difficult balance. Whilst they are disrupting, breaking habits and breaking boundaries, they don't lose their signature sense of self. Lesson 3. Brands build difference by changing, but staying the same. This is one of my favourite quotes from Jeremy Bullmore. People build brands the way birds build nests, through the straws and scraps they chance upon. It's a favourite because it so effortlessly and elegantly lands the point. Big and small encounters, sometimes over a whole lifetime, add up to a sense of a brand that we store in our heads. Now, if I may be so bold, I'm going to take Jeremy's quote one step further. Nests might be made from straws and scraps, but the strongest have those straws and scraps entwined, connected and hardwired together, working in unison to create something of substance. If the encounters and experiences with brands have to change over time, and they do, if brands are going to continue to break habits, break boundaries and remain relevant, then how can all encounters also hang together and be connected? By brands showing up consistently across time and every touch point in a way that's different to the competition and authentic to themselves. Brands that are really good at this have a strong sense not just of who they are, but how to encode that in everything they do, like this brand. Premier Inn has a very practical purpose, helping people to rest easy, and the investments they've made in experience and customer journey have really paid off. Their market share is up 4 points in 10 years, and 3/4 of their bookings are repeat customers, and we are thrilled to welcome them as a new entry in this year's Top 75. But beyond the purpose, Premier Inn code their personality in everything they do. Here's a range of assets from Premier Inn, including a logo and digital ads, as well as some in-room collateral, and there's even a pic of a reception area there. We ran all of these and the latest TV ad through our Wizzy AI decoder, which is able to plot all sorts of branded assets onto this elliptical map where each of the colours represents different expressions of consumers' emotive needs. The AI decoder tells us that all of these assets gravitate to this space here, signified by the colour yellow. Premier Inn's laid-back, easy qualities are imbued in the way they show up across this variety of encounters and experiences. The pops of colour, the neons, the playfulness in the visuals and the tone of voice, such as the "well, hello" in the reception area. The fun and dynamism in the TV ad exude ease, a feeling of escape and irreverence. Premier Inn have mastered the art of balance. They are able to change and remain contemporary while staying the same and seeming like nothing is changing at all. And they're not alone. Several of the brands we've featured today have this in common. Dove's work has changed considerably since the campaign for Real Beauty began, but a red thread of care, empathy and gentle sensitivity means it hangs together even over 20 years. The key to this has been consistency in message and tone of voice. Everything they do looks, sounds, smells and feels Dove. Yet they have remained firmly connected to the cultural pulse by evolving their portrayal of self-esteem. M&S Food imbues everything they do with a sense of standing out and being confident, which is what defines this space. Not ostentatious, not arrogant, but something a bit more special. It enchants, it sparkles, it's clever, it's artful, it's sophisticated, and it's bound to impress. Now, I know all of this can sound a little bit woolly, but that couldn't be further from the truth. That's because brands that have straws and scraps that intertwine, that connect together and create a strong shape of the brand in people's heads might have what we call strong emotive cohesion. And those brands have stronger perceived relative difference. So, 3 lessons about difference. Perceived relative difference is what counts. You need to be both different and meaningful to maximize growth. And brands build difference by changing but staying the same. Mr. Miyagi said, "Man who can catch fly with chopstick accomplish anything." Now, I'm not here to conclude whether catching a fly with chopsticks is harder or easier than building a brand, but they do have some things in common. They require focus, precision, and quick responses. And Daniel San had Mr. Miyagi to help him focus on the right things, be precise about where he put his efforts, and to respond quickly to the opportunities and the challenges on the path to his goals. And he did that by passing on everything he's learnt and helping Daniel San apply it in practice. And you, well, you have all the people, the knowledge, and the resources at Kantar. And if you bet on your brand and dial up your difference, you will be a black belt in brand building.